cowboy named Marcus Cole tracked a mysterious letter across the 1881 Wyoming Territory, expecting to find the woman carrying his child, but instead discovered four pregnant sisters locked away by a monster who sold their babies for profit. As he risked everything to free them from their prison shed, one question burned in his mind. Was he saving them, or were they about to save him from a life of emptiness? The scorching sun beat down on Marcus Cole's face as his horse stumbled through another patch of dry grass that crunched like old bones under its hooves. 3 weeks of riding through the Wyoming Territory had left both man and beast looking like walking scarecrows, dust caked in every crease, water running low, and hope hanging by a thread thinner than spider silk. Marcus pulled the wrinkled letter from his shirt pocket for the 100th time, squinting at the faded ink that had been his only companion since leaving Kansas. My dearest Marcus, it began in Rebecca's flowing handwriting. I am with child and need you desperately. Come to Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory. Time is running short. The paper felt soft as cloth from all his handling, and the words seemed to shimmer in the heat like a mirage. His mare whinnied and lifted her head, ears pricked forward. There, shimmering through the heat waves, stood a collection of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been dropped from the sky and forgotten. Willow Creek wasn't much to look at. Maybe 20 structures total, half of them leaning against each other like drunken friends. The main street was nothing more than packed dirt with wooden sidewalks that had seen better days. Marcus had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the long journey. He'd pictured Rebecca running toward him, her belly round with his child, tears of joy streaming down her face. He dreamed of holding her close and promising that everything would be different this time, that he wouldn't be like his own father, who disappeared one winter morning when Marcus was 12 and never came back. But as his horse's hooves echoed on the wooden planks of Main Street, something felt wrong. The town was too quiet. Even the saloon, which should have been buzzing with afternoon customers, sat silent as a tomb. A few faces peered out from behind curtains, then quickly disappeared. It was like riding into a ghost town where the ghosts were still alive but too scared to show themselves. The general store seemed like the best place to start asking questions. Marcus tied his horse to the hitching post and pushed through the creaky door, setting off a bell that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. Behind the counter stood a man so thin, he looked like he might blow away in a strong wind, with nervous eyes that kept darting toward the door. Help you with something, stranger? The clerk asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus pulled out the letter and smoothed it on the counter. I'm looking for Rebecca Patterson. She wrote to me from this town, said she was staying here with family. The clerk's face went pale as old milk. He glanced at the letter, then at Marcus, then toward the door again like he expected trouble to walk through it any second. Don't know nobody by that name, he said quickly. Been here 10 years, know every soul in town. Ain't no Rebecca Patterson. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He stared at the letter, then back at the clerk. But she wrote from here. Look at the address, Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory. Clear as day. Could be another Willow Creek somewhere? The clerk offered, but his tone suggested he was grasping at straws. Though I reckon we're the only one for 300 miles in any direction. Marcus felt the ground shifting under his feet like quicksand. 3 weeks of hard riding, nearly every dollar he owned spent on supplies, all based on a letter from a woman who apparently didn't exist. He'd quit his job at the cattle ranch, sold his few possessions, burned every bridge behind him to get here. And for what? The saloon keeper told the same story. So did the blacksmith, whose massive arms were covered in soot as he pounded red-hot iron into horseshoes. The hotel owner, a round woman with kind eyes, shook her head sadly and offered him a room for half price, clearly feeling sorry for him. Even the preacher, a gentle man with silver hair, had never heard of Rebecca Patterson. Marcus stood in the middle of the dusty street as the sun began to sink toward the mountains, holding a letter that felt like it was burning a hole in his hand. The few townspeople who'd ventured out gave him wide berths, whispering among themselves. He was the fool who'd chased a ghost across half the territory, and now everyone knew it. But just as he turned toward his horse, ready to admit defeat and figure out where to go next, The preacher's wife appeared at his elbow like a guardian angel. She was a small woman with gray streaks in her brown hair and eyes that had seen too much sadness. "Wait," she whispered, looking around nervously to make sure no one was listening. "There might be something. Old Jeremiah's place, up in the hills. He keeps to himself mostly, but sometimes we hear things." Marcus felt a spark of hope flicker back to life in his chest. "What kind of things?" The woman bit her lip and glanced around again. "Women crying. Sounds that don't seem natural for a man living alone. Most folks think it's just the wind playing tricks, but—" She trailed off, seeming to wrestle with herself. "But you don't think so," Marcus finished. She shook her head. "My grandmother always said the mountains don't lie. If you hear crying on the wind, there's someone up there who needs help." She gave him directions in a voice so quiet he had to lean close to hear. "Follow the creek bed until you reach the lightning-split pine, then head north toward the red rocks. But be careful, Mr. Cole. Jeremiah don't take kindly to visitors, and there's stories." "What kind of stories?" The woman's eyes went distant, like she was looking at something far away and terrible. "Young women who come to town asking about work or marriage prospects, then disappear without a trace. Could be they just moved on, looking for better opportunities. Or could be something else entirely." The narrow mountain trail twisted through thick pine forests that blocked out most of the dying sunlight, creating shadows that seemed to move when Marcus wasn't looking directly at them. His mare picked her way carefully over loose rocks and fallen branches, her breathing getting heavier as they climbed higher into air that felt thin as paper in his lungs. Every 100 yards or so, Marcus stopped to listen, but heard nothing except the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. The preacher's wife's directions echoed in his mind like a prayer. Lightning-split pine, then north to the red rocks. Simple enough, but in this maze of trees and shadows, simple could turn deadly fast. The creek beside the trail bubbled and chattered over smooth stones, the only cheerful sound in an increasingly dark world. Marcus had been following it for over an hour when he finally spotted what he was looking for. A massive pine tree that had been split right down the middle by lightning, its blackened trunk standing like a monument to nature's power. He turned north as instructed, leaving the creek behind and climbing even steeper terrain toward a ridge lined with red sandstone formations that glowed like fire in the last rays of sunlight. The trail here was barely visible, more of a deer path than anything meant for horses, and Marcus had to dismount and lead his mare by the reins to keep from tumbling down the mountainside. That's when he heard it, faint but unmistakable. The sound of a woman crying. Marcus froze, straining his ears. There it was again, carried on the evening breeze like a ghost's whisper. Not the wind playing tricks, as some folks in town believed, but real human voices filled with real human pain. Multiple voices, in fact, harmonizing in a symphony of despair that made his skin crawl. He tied his horse to a sturdy pine and continued on foot, moving as quietly as possible over the rocky ground. The crying grew louder as he crested the ridge, and suddenly he could see his destination spread out below him like a scene from a nightmare. A sprawling log cabin sat in the center of a natural clearing, surrounded by a dozen smaller buildings that looked more like prison cells than any kind of normal outbuildings. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, and lamplight flickered in its windows, but there was something wrong with the whole setup. Too isolated, too hidden, too much like a place where bad things happened and nobody ever found out about them. Marcus crept closer, using the pine trees for cover. Through the cabin's main window, he could see a massive man hunched over a wooden table, counting what looked like coins or bills by lamplight. The man was huge, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like a bull and hands that could probably crush a man's skull without much effort. This had to be Jeremiah. But the crying wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from one of the smaller buildings, a sturdy-looking shed with no windows and a heavy lock on its door. As Marcus crept closer, he could make out voices, young women's voices, whispering urgently to each other in tones filled with fear and exhaustion. "Someone's coming," one voice said, barely audible through the thick wooden walls. "Hush, Mary," another voice replied. "Could be him checking on us again." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. These weren't just random women who'd gotten lost in the mountains. They were prisoners locked away like animals in a cage. And from the sound of their voices, they'd been here long enough to develop a system for dealing with their captors' visits. He circled the shed, looking for another way in or at least a way to communicate with whoever was inside without alerting the giant in the cabin. The building was solid thick logs chinked with mud, a heavy wooden door secured with a padlock that looked new and strong. But near the roofline, he spotted a small gap between the logs, probably meant for ventilation. Marcus found a sturdy stick and tapped gently on the wall beside the gap. The whispering inside stopped immediately. "Hello?" he called softly. "My name is Marcus Cole. I'm not here to hurt anyone. Are you being held against your will?" Silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then a voice answered, older than the others, trying to sound brave despite obvious fear. "Who are you? What do you want?" "I came looking for someone named Rebecca Patterson. Do you know her?" Another long pause, then a different voice, younger, sadder. "Rebecca died 3 months ago. Her and her baby both. Jeremiah buried them up on the ridge when she wouldn't stop fighting back." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Rebecca was dead. Had been dead for months while he'd been planning his journey, dreaming of their reunion, imagining the family they'd build together. But if Rebecca was dead, then who had written the letter? And why? "How many of you are in there?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "4, the older voice replied. "We've been here since spring. We answered advertisements for mail-order brides. But when we got here," her voice broke, "we're all expecting babies. He keeps us locked up until we give birth, then sells the children to couples who can't have their own. Those of us who survive get to do it all over again." Marcus felt rage building in his chest like a wildfire. This wasn't just kidnapping. It was a whole evil business built on the suffering of innocent women. And Rebecca had somehow gotten word out, probably in her final desperate moments, hoping someone would come to save the others even if it was too late to save her. But as he started working on the lock with his knife, trying to figure out how to free the women without alerting Jeremiah, he heard the cabin door slam shut. Heavy footsteps crunched across the clearing, moving in his direction with purpose and confidence. Well, a voice boomed through the darkness, deep, rough, and absolutely without mercy. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero." Marcus spun around to see Jeremiah emerging from the shadows, and the man was even more terrifying up close than he'd appeared through the window. Not just tall and broad, but carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight and didn't expect to start now. In his massive hands, he held a rifle that looked like a toy but could kill Marcus before he even cleared leather with his own pistol. "You picked the wrong place to play savior, boy," Jeremiah continued, stepping closer with each word. "These girls are valuable property. Each one's worth more than you'll see in 5 years of honest work." Marcus positioned himself between the locked shed and the rifle, his hand hovering near his gun but knowing it was useless at this range. Behind him, he could hear the women moving around inside their prison, probably pressed against the walls listening to every word. "Let them go, Jeremiah," Marcus said, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "This doesn't have to end badly for anyone." The giant's laughter echoed off the mountains like thunder. "Doesn't have to, but it's going to. See, you just cost me a lot of money by finding this place. Someone's got to pay for that, and it might as well be you." As Jeremiah raised the rifle, Marcus realized he was about to die in this remote mountain clearing, and the 4 women in the shed would continue suffering because he'd failed them just like he'd failed Rebecca. But sometimes, when everything seems lost, the most unexpected things can happen. And sometimes, heroes come from the most unlikely places. The rifle barrel stared at Marcus like a black eye promising death, but in that split second before Jeremiah could pull the trigger, something extraordinary happened. The locked shed door exploded outward with a crash that echoed through the mountain clearing like thunder. "Run, Marcus!" A woman's voice shouted as 4 figures burst from their wooden prison in a coordinated rush that caught everyone by surprise. The oldest woman, her dark hair wild but her eyes blazing with determination, threw herself at Jeremiah's legs while another grabbed for his rifle. A third woman, younger but moving with deadly purpose, swung a heavy piece of firewood she'd somehow hidden inside the shed. Jeremiah stumbled backward, cursing and trying to keep his balance as the women swarmed him like angry hornets. But he was too big, too strong, and too experienced at violence. With a roar of rage, he threw off the first woman and backhanded another, sending her sprawling across the dirt. The rifle swung toward Marcus again, and this time there would be no escape. Marcus dove sideways just as the gun fired, the bullet whining past his ear close enough to burn. He rolled behind a pile of chopped wood and came up with his pistol drawn, but Jeremiah had already grabbed one of the women, the youngest, a girl who couldn't be more than 16, and was using her as a human shield. "Drop the gun, hero," Jeremiah snarled, pressing his knife against the girl's throat hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "Or little Mary here gets to find out how sharp my blade is." Marcus kept his pistol trained on the giant, looking for any opening, any chance to take a shot without risking the girl's life. But Jeremiah was too smart, too experienced at this deadly game. He kept Mary positioned perfectly, using her terror as his armor. "That's better," Jeremiah said when Marcus hesitated. "Now kick that gun away and we can discuss how you're going to pay for all the trouble you've caused." But the three other women hadn't given up. While Jeremiah focused on Marcus, they were spreading out, moving to different positions around the clearing. The oldest woman, she looked like she might be in her early 20s despite the hardships she'd endured, caught Marcus's eye and nodded toward a stack of tools leaning against the cabin wall. Her name was Catherine, Marcus would learn later, and she'd been a schoolteacher before answering Jeremiah's false advertisement for a bride. 3 months of captivity hadn't broken her spirit. It had hardened it into something sharp and dangerous as a sword blade. "You want to know the funny thing about your plan?" Catherine called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "We figured out how to pick that lock weeks ago. Been planning this moment, waiting for the right time." Jeremiah's head snapped toward her, confusion replacing confidence on his brutal features. "What are you talking about?" Ruth, a redhead with freckles and eyes like green fire, laughed from her position near the cabin. "You think we've just been sitting in there crying all this time? We've been working, planning, getting ready." She held up something that glinted in the lamplight, a long piece of metal filed to a sharp point. The fourth woman, Anna, had the darkest hair and the quietest voice, but her hands were steady as she picked up a heavy iron poker from beside the cabin's fireplace. "Every night while you slept, we took turns working on that lock, loosening the hinges, finding weapons, making plans." Marcus realized what was happening. These women had turned themselves into a coordinated fighting unit, and they'd been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. They weren't helpless victims anymore. They were hunters, and Jeremiah was their prey. "Enough talk," the giant growled, pressing his knife deeper against Mary's throat. "I don't care how clever you think you are. This girl dies if anyone moves another step." But Mary, terrified as she was, had been listening to every word, and she'd been planning too. With a sudden twist that caught Jeremiah completely off guard, she bit down hard on his arm and ducked away from the knife, giving Marcus the opening he needed. The gunshot rang out like Judgment Day, echoing off the mountain peaks and sending birds exploding from the pine trees in a black cloud of beating wings. Jeremiah spun around, clutching his shoulder where Marcus's bullet had found its mark, but he wasn't done fighting. With a roar of pain and rage, he charged straight at Marcus, his massive frame moving faster than something that big had any right to move. Marcus fired again, but Jeremiah's momentum carried him forward even as the second bullet hit him in the chest. They crashed together in a tangle of arms and legs, rolling across the clearing in a desperate struggle for the knife that had fallen from the giant's hand. Jeremiah's size and strength gave him the advantage even wounded, and his hands closed around Marcus's throat with crushing force. Black spots danced across Marcus's vision as his air supply cut off, and he could hear the women shouting his name from what seemed like a great distance. Then Catherine appeared above them, holding a heavy cast-iron skillet she'd grabbed from the cabin, and brought it down on Jeremiah's skull with a sound like a church bell ringing. The giant's grip loosened, His eyes rolled back, and he toppled sideways into the dirt. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were heavy breathing and the distant whisper of wind through the pine trees. Then Mary, still shaking from her ordeal, knelt beside Jeremiah and checked for a pulse. "He's alive," she announced. "But he's going to have a headache that lasts until Christmas." Marcus struggled to his feet, rubbing his bruised throat and looking around at the 4 women who had just helped save his life. They stood in a rough circle around their fallen captor, and despite everything they'd been through, there was something magnificent about them. Battered but not broken, frightened but not defeated. "We need to tie him up before he wakes up," Catherine said, already moving toward the cabin to look for rope. "And then we need to search this place top to bottom. If he's been doing this for months or years, there might be evidence that could help other families find their missing children." As they worked together to secure Jeremiah and gather evidence of his crimes, Marcus found himself thinking about the letter that had brought him here. Rebecca hadn't lied to him. She'd been trying to save these women even as she lay dying. Her final act hadn't been about herself or even about him. It had been about making sure someone would come to help the others she was leaving behind. But as the adrenaline of the fight began to wear off, new challenges presented themselves. They were miles from civilization, in the middle of nowhere, with 4 pregnant women who'd been surviving on minimal food and water for months. Getting them safely back to town would require planning, supplies, and more luck than Marcus felt comfortable counting on. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a nagging worry grew stronger with each passing minute. If Jeremiah had been running this operation for as long as it seemed, there might be other people involved. Partners, customers, accomplices who would come looking when he failed to show up for scheduled meetings. The nightmare was far from over, and morning was still hours away. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks like a thief afraid of being caught, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that should have been beautiful but somehow felt ominous in the strange light filtering through the pine trees. Marcus stood guard over the still unconscious Jeremiah while the 4 women methodically searched every building in the compound, their movements careful and deliberate despite their obvious exhaustion. What they found in the cabin's main room made Marcus's stomach turn. A large wooden desk covered with correspondence, dozens of letters from women across the frontier responding to false advertisements for mail-order brides. Names, addresses, descriptions of desperate circumstances that had made them vulnerable to Jeremiah's promises. Some letters were dated as far back as 2 years, suggesting this evil business had been operating much longer than anyone had imagined. "Look at this," Ruth called softly from beside a locked cabinet that Anna had managed to pry open with a fireplace poker. Inside were carefully organized files containing what appeared to be sales records. Names of babies, birth dates, and payments received from couples who thought they were adopting orphans through legitimate channels. Catherine studied the papers with the sharp eye of someone who'd once taught children to read and write. "He's been selling babies for $500 each," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Some families paid even more for infants under 6 months old. Mary, the youngest of the group, had found something else entirely. A strongbox hidden beneath loose floorboards near the fireplace. When they forced it open, it contained more money than any of them had ever seen in one place. Hundreds of dollars in gold coins and bills, all blood money earned from the suffering of women and the theft of their children. "We're taking every penny," Marcus decided, hefting the heavy box. "Money made from crimes belongs to the victims, and that's you 4. But Anna, who had spoken the least since their escape, pointed out a problem none of them had considered. "What about the babies who've already been sold? Some of these records show sales from over a year ago. Those children are living with families who think they're their legal children now." The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a dying fire. How do you reunite stolen babies with mothers who might be dead? How do you tell loving adoptive parents that their children were obtained through murder and kidnapping? How do you fix something so thoroughly broken that the pieces might never fit back together? "One problem at a time," Catherine said firmly. "First we get out of here alive. Then we get to town and involve the law. Then we figure out how to help those babies and their real families." They spent the next hour gathering supplies for the journey back to Willow Creek. Jeremiah's cabin contained enough food to last them several days, plus blankets, weapons, and most importantly, a sturdy wagon with 2 horses that could carry the women safely down the mountain trail. As they prepared to leave, Jeremiah finally began to stir. Marcus quickly checked the ropes binding the giant's hands and feet, making sure they were secure. The man's eyes opened slowly, focusing with difficulty on the faces gathered around him. "You think you've won something?" he growled, his voice thick with pain and fury. "But you have no idea what you've stumbled into. This operation has friends in high places, people who won't take kindly to their business being disrupted." Ruth laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Are you trying to scare us? After everything we've survived, you think we're afraid of some mysterious partners?" "You should be," Jeremiah insisted. "The territorial judge who's been signing the adoption papers, the shipping company that moves the babies, the doctors who've been declaring mothers dead when they're still alive. They all have stakes in keeping this quiet." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If Jeremiah was telling the truth, they weren't just fighting one evil man. They were up against an entire network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "All the more reason to get this evidence to honest authorities as quickly as possible," Catherine said. But Marcus could hear the worry in her voice despite her brave words. They loaded Jeremiah into the back of his own wagon, still tied securely but covered with blankets to keep him from freezing during the journey. It seemed fitting that he should experience some discomfort after the months of suffering he'd inflicted on others. The trip down the mountain trail proved even more treacherous with a loaded wagon than it had been on horseback. The wheels slipped on loose rocks, and more than once they had to stop to prevent the entire load from sliding sideways off the narrow path. But the women proved to be remarkably resourceful, taking turns walking alongside to balance the weight and guide the horses around the worst obstacles. As they descended toward the prairie, Marcus found himself watching them with growing admiration. Catherine's natural leadership, Ruth's unbreakable spirit, Mary's quiet courage, and Anna's practical wisdom. They'd been through hell and emerged stronger rather than broken. They'd saved him as much as he'd saved them, maybe more. But around midday, as they stopped to rest the horses beside a small stream, Anna suddenly went pale and doubled over with pain. The others rushed to her side, and Marcus realized with growing alarm that the stress and excitement of the past 24 hours might have triggered something they weren't prepared to handle. "The baby's coming," Anna gasped between contractions. "I can feel it. Something's wrong." They were still hours from town, miles from the nearest doctor, with limited medical supplies and no experience delivering babies under these conditions. Marcus looked around at the vast empty landscape stretching in all directions, feeling more helpless than he had when facing Jeremiah's rifle. But once again, the women proved they were stronger than their circumstances. Catherine had assisted with births during her teaching days in farming communities, and Ruth had helped deliver her younger siblings back in Ohio. Working together, with Mary boiling water over a hastily built fire and Marcus standing guard to ensure their privacy, they managed to bring Anna's baby safely into the world. The infant's first cry echoed across the Wyoming prairie like a declaration of independence. A new life born free instead of into slavery, surrounded by people who would protect rather than exploit her. Anna wept as she held her daughter for the first time, and there wasn't a dry eye in the group. "What will you name her?" Mary asked softly. Anna looked up at Marcus, then at each of her fellow survivors. "Hope," she said simply. "Her name is Hope, because that's what you all gave me when I thought it was lost forever." As they prepared to continue their journey, now with a newborn baby to protect, Marcus realized their story was far from over. They still had to reach town safely, convince the authorities to take action against a potentially powerful conspiracy, and figure out how to rebuild their lives from the ashes of their trauma. But for the first time since reading Rebecca's letter, Marcus felt like they might actually succeed. These 4 women had already proven they could survive anything, and together they were stronger than any force that might try to stop them. The afternoon sun climbed higher as their wagon rolled toward whatever destiny awaited them in Willow Creek, carrying 5 adults, 1 baby, and enough evidence to shake the foundations of the territorial justice system. 3 riders charged across the prairie toward their wagon like demons racing to collect souls, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that could be seen for miles in the clear afternoon air. Marcus squinted against the sun's glare, counting the approaching figures while his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. But with 4 women and a newborn baby to protect, a gunfight was the last thing they needed. "Friends of yours?" Catherine asked dryly, though her voice carried an edge of steel that hadn't been there when Marcus first met her in that mountain prison. "Not likely," Marcus replied, helping Anna secure baby Hope in a makeshift cradle they'd fashioned from blankets and wooden crates. The infant slept peacefully, unaware that danger was thundering toward them across the grassland at full gallop. The lead rider pulled up 20 yards away, close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid any sudden moves. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, wearing a clean suit that looked expensive and a badge that caught the sunlight like a silver star. Behind him rode 2 younger men who had the look of professional gunfighters, cold eyes, steady hands, and weapons worn with the ease of long practice. "Afternoon, folks," the badge-wearer called out in a voice smooth as honey over broken glass. "I'm Deputy Marshal Wilson, Territorial Authority. We've had reports of some trouble up in the mountains, and I'm here to sort things out." Marcus felt his stomach drop like a stone down a well. If Jeremiah had been telling the truth about having friends in high places, then this marshal might be part of the corruption they were trying to expose. But if he was legitimate law enforcement, then help had arrived just when they needed it most. "What kind of trouble?" Marcus asked carefully, keeping his voice neutral while his mind raced through possibilities. Marshal Wilson's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes. "Well, seems someone attacked a respected citizen named Jeremiah Hayes up at his ranch, stole his property, and kidnapped some women who were under his protection. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Ruth let out a bark of bitter laughter that echoed across the prairie. "Protection? Is that what you call keeping 4 pregnant women locked in a shed like animals?" The marshal's expression didn't change, but one of his gunfighters shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his weapon. "Now, miss, that's a serious accusation. Mr. Hayes is a respected businessman who's done considerable good for families looking to adopt children. If there's been some misunderstanding..." "Misunderstanding?" Mary interrupted, her young voice cracking with emotion. "He murdered my friend Rebecca and sold her baby. He was planning to do the same to all of us." Marshal Wilson held up a hand as if trying to calm an agitated child. "I'm sure you ladies have been through a difficult experience, and sometimes trauma can make people remember things differently than they actually happened. That's why it's important to let proper authorities handle these situations." Marcus realized they were trapped in a nightmare that was getting worse by the minute. If this marshal was part of Jeremiah's network, then bringing them to town wouldn't mean safety. It would mean walking straight into the spider's web. But if they refused to cooperate, 3 armed men could easily overpower their small group. "We have evidence," Catherine said firmly, pulling out some of the papers they'd taken from Jeremiah's cabin. Records of illegal adoptions, correspondence with victims, financial transactions, everything documented in his own handwriting. The marshal's eyes fixed on the papers like a hawk spotting a mouse. "Well, now, that sounds like important evidence that should be examined by qualified officials. Why don't you hand those over, and we'll make sure they get proper attention." "I think we'll hold on to them until we reach town," Marcus said, stepping slightly forward to position himself between the women and the mounted men, "where we can present everything to multiple authorities at the same time." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as the marshal's friendly mask finally slipped away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I'm afraid that's not how this works, friend. I'm the law out here, and when I ask for evidence, you hand it over. No discussion, no negotiation." One of the gunfighters, a lean man with a scar running down his left cheek, spoke for the first time. "Marshal's being real polite about this, but his patience ain't unlimited. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard." Anna clutched baby Hope closer to her chest, the infant beginning to fuss as if sensing the tension in the air. Marcus calculated distances, angles, cover options, but every scenario ended with innocent people getting hurt. They needed a different kind of solution. "What if we made a deal?" Catherine suggested, her teacher's mind working through the problem like a complex equation. We'll give you some of the evidence to examine, but we keep copies for ourselves. That way, everyone's interests are protected. Marshal Wilson considered this, probably wondering if they actually had made copies or were just bluffing. Finally, he nodded slowly. Reasonable compromise. But I'll need to see Mr. Hayes as well, to get his side of the story. He's in the wagon, Marcus said, jerking his thumb toward the back where Jeremiah lay bound and gagged under a pile of blankets. Though he might not be very talkative at the moment. The marshal dismounted and walked to the wagon, pulling back the blankets to reveal their prisoner. Jeremiah's eyes were open, glaring with pure hatred at everyone in sight. When the marshal removed his gag, the first words out of the giant's mouth were curses that would have made a sailor blush. They ambushed me on my own property, Jeremiah raged. Stole my horses, my wagon, my money, everything. And they've got my business records that contain private information about families I've helped. But as Jeremiah continued his tirade, Marcus noticed something interesting. The marshal's face was growing darker with each word, and his two gunfighters were exchanging glances that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with their boss's reactions. "Shut up, Hayes," the marshal finally snapped, his mask of authority slipping completely. "You were supposed to be careful, discreet. Instead, you've brought attention from half the territory." Jeremiah's mouth fell open as he realized his supposed ally was angry at him rather than at his captors. "Wilson, you can't be thinking of. I'm thinking you've outlived your usefulness," the marshal interrupted, pulling his gun with smooth efficiency. "And that loose ends need to be tied up before they cause more problems." Marcus drew his own weapon, but he was facing 3 armed men who had the advantage of position and preparation. The situation had gone from bad to catastrophic in the space of a heartbeat, and he could see no way out that didn't end with blood on the prairie grass. But sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected directions. As Marshal Wilson raised his gun toward the wagon, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the grassland, this time from the direction of town. A new group of riders was approaching, and the star on the lead rider's chest caught the afternoon sun like a beacon of hope. "That's the real territorial marshal," one of Wilson's gunfighters said quietly, his voice carrying a note of panic. "The one from Cheyenne. What's he doing here?" Wilson's face went pale as old bones. Whatever game he'd been playing, the arrival of legitimate federal authority meant the rules had just changed completely. The real territorial marshal rode like a man who'd spent his entire life in the saddle, sitting straight and confident as his black stallion covered ground with powerful strides that ate up the distance between his small posse and the tense standoff on the prairie. Behind him rode 3 deputies whose badges gleamed with the authority of federal law, and their faces carried the grim determination of men who'd seen too much injustice to let any more slide by. "Well, well," the genuine marshal called out as he reined in his horse just outside pistol range, his keen eyes taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. "Deputy Marshal Wilson, isn't it? Funny thing. I've been looking all over creation for you after some interesting reports came in from Kansas about missing women and illegal adoptions." Wilson's hand trembled slightly as he tried to decide whether to lower his weapon or use it, while his 2 gunfighters looked increasingly uncomfortable with their situation. The balance of power had shifted dramatically with the arrival of federal authority, and everyone present knew it. "Marshal Brennan," Wilson said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I'm investigating reports of criminal activity. These people attacked a respectable businessman and stole his property." Marshal Brennan's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile if it contained any warmth. "Respectable businessman? That's an interesting way to describe Jeremiah Hayes, considering we've been tracking his baby-selling operation for the better part of 6 months. Marcus felt a surge of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. Real law enforcement, honest authority, legitimate help finally, after all the terror and uncertainty, someone with the power to actually fix this nightmare. "You're under arrest, Wilson," Marshal Brennan continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Along with your associates there. We've got enough evidence to hang all 3 of you for conspiracy, kidnapping, and accessory to murder." But Wilson wasn't going down without a fight. with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. He spun toward the wagon and raised his gun toward Anna and her baby. Nobody moves or the woman and child die. I'm riding out of here, and anyone who tries to stop me will have their blood on their hands. The prairie exploded into chaos as everyone reached for weapons at the same time. Marcus threw himself sideways, trying to get a clear shot at Wilson while staying between the corrupt lawmen and the women. Marshal Brennan and his deputies spread out, their own guns drawn and ready. Wilson's gunfighters found themselves caught in the middle, facing the choice between loyalty to their boss and survival against overwhelming odds. The scarred gunfighter made his choice first, dropping his weapon and raising his hands. "I ain't dying for nobody's money," he declared. "This whole thing's gone too far." His partner hesitated a moment longer, then followed suit. "Count me out too, Wilson. You're on your own." But Wilson wasn't finished. With Anna and baby Hope as his shield, he began backing toward his horse, keeping his gun trained on the infant while sweat poured down his face. 20 years I've been working this territory, building connections, making arrangements. I'm not going to let it all fall apart because of 4 troublemaking women. "Let them go, Wilson," Marshal Brennan said quietly, his own weapon steady as a rock. "You've got nowhere to run, and killing innocent people won't change that." Catherine stepped forward, her hands empty but her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years managing unruly children. "Marshal Wilson, you seem like an intelligent man. Surely you can see that harming us won't improve your situation in any way. Stay back." Wilson snarled, pressing his gun closer to baby Hope, who began crying at the sharp tone of his voice. "I know what happens to people like me in territorial prison. I'd rather die out here than rot in a cell." Anna's voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "That baby you're threatening? She was born free because people cared enough to fight for her. If you hurt her, you'll have to answer to more than just the law. You'll have to answer to God." For a moment, Wilson's resolve seemed to waver. His eyes darted between the federal marshals, the evidence scattered around the wagon, and the tiny infant whose life hung in the balance of his next decision. Whatever calculation he was making, it didn't take long to reach a conclusion. "God," he laughed bitterly. "God abandoned this territory years ago, when men like Jeremiah Hayes started turning human suffering into profit. If there was any justice in this world, none of this would have happened in the first place." But as Wilson continued his desperate monologue, Marcus noticed something the corrupt marshal had missed in his panic. Ruth had been quietly working her way around behind the horses, moving with the stealth of someone who'd learned to survive by staying invisible. Now she was close enough to make a difference, if she could find the right moment. "You're wrong about God," Mary said softly, her young voice carrying across the prairie like a prayer. "Maybe he didn't stop bad things from happening, but he sent good people to fight against them. He sent Marcus to find us, and you to bring real justice." Wilson's laugh turned into something that sounded more like a sob. "Justice? There's no justice for people like us. The system's rigged from top to bottom, and the only way to survive is to rig it back." That's when Ruth made her move. Like a ghost materializing from shadow, she appeared behind Wilson's horse and grabbed the animal's bridle, causing it to rear and sidestep just enough to throw off the marshal's aim. In that instant of distraction, Marcus took his shot. The gunshot echoed across the prairie like thunder, and Wilson spun around, clutching his shoulder where Marcus's bullet had found its mark. His weapon flew from his hand, landing in the dirt several feet away, while he stumbled and fell to his knees. Marshal Brennan and his deputies moved in quickly, securing the wounded man while Anna clutched baby Hope protectively against her chest. The infant had stopped crying, as if sensing that the immediate danger had passed. "Nice shooting," Brennan commented to Marcus as they helped Wilson to his feet. "Clean wound, nothing vital hit. He'll live to stand trial." As the federal marshals took custody of their prisoners and began sorting through the evidence, Marcus found himself looking around at the 4 women who had transformed from victims into survivors, from prisoners into fighters. They stood together in the afternoon sunlight, battered but unbroken, holding a baby who represented hope for the future. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, speaking the question that was on everyone's mind. Marshal Brennan pushed back his hat and considered the vast landscape stretching toward the horizon. Now we start the hard work of fixing what's been broken, reuniting families, prosecuting criminals, and making sure this kind of thing never happens again. He paused, looking at each of the women in turn. But that's going to take time, and it's going to take courage from people willing to testify, to fight, to refuse to give up even when things seem impossible. Ruth smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Marcus had seen from her. Marshal, after what we've been through, impossible is just another word for difficult. And we've gotten pretty good at handling difficult. As they prepared for the final leg of their journey to Willow Creek, Marcus realized that Rebecca's letter had brought him exactly where he needed to be. Not to find the woman he'd lost, but to help save the women who still had futures to build. Sometimes the greatest journeys don't take you where you plan to go. They take you where you're needed most. The afternoon sun continued its journey across the Wyoming sky, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber while their small convoy began moving toward town, carrying with them evidence that would shake the territorial justice system to its foundations and 4 women who had refused to let evil win. The sound of church bells ringing in celebration filled the evening air as their wagon rolled into Willow Creek, but the warm welcome Marcus had expected turned into something far more complicated when half the townspeople lined the streets with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Word had apparently traveled faster than their horses, and not everyone was pleased to see the return of the man who'd brought such dangerous attention to their quiet settlement. "Look what he's dragged back with him," Marcus heard someone whisper as they passed the general store. "For women in the family way and no husbands in sight. Scandal's what it is." Catherine's jaw tightened at the comment, but she kept her chin high and her eyes forward. "Some people see trouble where others see justice," she said quietly to Marcus. "We'll find out soon enough which kind of town this really is." The wagon stopped in front of the marshal's office, where Marshal Brennan had already set up a temporary headquarters with the help of the local sheriff, a nervous man named Deputy Collins who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Papers and evidence boxes covered every available surface, and the jail cells in the back were filling up with people connected to Jeremiah's network. "Welcome to Willow Creek," Brennan said as he helped the women down from the wagon. "I've arranged rooms at the hotel for all of you, and Doc Harrison is standing by to check everyone over, especially the new mother and her baby." But as they walked toward the hotel, Anna suddenly stopped dead in her tracks, staring at a wanted poster nailed to the post office wall. Her face went pale as fresh snow, and baby Hope began fussing as if sensing her mother's distress. "That's him?" Anna whispered, pointing at the poster with a trembling finger. "That's the man who told me about the marriage opportunity in the first place. Samuel Garrett. He said he was a minister who helped arrange Christian unions for lonely hearts." Marcus studied the poster, which showed a thin man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, the perfect appearance for someone who preyed on desperate women. According to the text, Garrett was wanted in 3 territories for fraud, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The reward was substantial enough to attract serious bounty hunters. "He's the one who recruited most of us," Ruth added, her voice tight with old anger. "Traveled from town to town, preaching about the blessings of frontier marriage and the opportunities waiting for brave women willing to build new lives in the West." Marshal Brennan's expression grew even more serious as he examined the poster. "If Garrett's still operating, then Jeremiah's network was bigger than we thought. This whole operation might stretch across multiple territories, with dozens of victims we haven't found yet." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. They'd captured Jeremiah and exposed the corruption in Willow Creek, but the larger criminal organization was still out there, still destroying lives, still turning human suffering into profit. Their victory was beginning to feel more like the end of the first battle than the end of the war. Dr. Harrison turned out to be a kindly man in his 60s who'd delivered more babies than anyone could count and had seen enough of life to judge people by their character rather than their circumstances. He examined Anna and baby Hope with gentle thoroughness, pronouncing both to be in remarkable health considering their recent ordeal. "This little one's got strong lungs and a good appetite," he announced with satisfaction. "And her mother's recovery is progressing better than I'd expected. Whatever you folks went through up in those mountains, it hasn't broken your fighting spirit." But the doctor's examination revealed something else that sent new shockwaves through their small group. Mary, the youngest of the 4 women, wasn't actually pregnant at all. She'd been binding her stomach with cloth to create the appearance of being with child, apparently as protection against Jeremiah's immediate attention. "I knew he preferred to wait until women were closer to giving birth," Mary explained when confronted with the discovery. "So I made myself look further along than I was, hoping to buy time for an escape opportunity." The revelation painted Mary's courage in an even brighter light. She'd risked terrible punishment to protect herself through deception, maintaining the charade for months while looking for any chance to help the others escape. At 16, she'd shown more strategic thinking than many adults would have managed under similar circumstances. As evening settled over Willow Creek, the 4 women gathered in Catherine's hotel room to plan their next steps. The money from Jeremiah's strongbox gave them options, but also responsibilities. Other victims needed help, other families needed answers, and other criminals needed to face justice. "We could take this money and disappear," Catherine said, laying out their choices with characteristic directness. "Start new lives somewhere far away from all this pain and danger. No one would blame us for wanting to put it all behind us. Or we could stay and fight," Ruth countered, her red hair catching the lamplight like fire. "Help Marshall Brennan track down Samuel Garrett and the rest of the network. Make sure no other women go through what we went through." Anna rocked baby Hope gently as she considered their options. "I want my daughter to grow up in a world where men like Jeremiah can't hurt innocent people. That means finishing what we started, doesn't it?" Mary, despite being the youngest, spoke with wisdom beyond her years. "Running away means they win. It means Rebecca died for nothing, and all those stolen babies stay lost forever. I can't live with that." Their decision was unanimous, but implementing it would require careful planning and considerable courage. Garrett was still out there somewhere, probably recruiting new victims even as they spoke. The network's financial backers needed to be identified and prosecuted. And most importantly, the stolen children needed to be found and reunited with their real families wherever possible. Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. He'd come to Wyoming territory as a broken man chasing a ghost, expecting to find either redemption or final proof of his worthlessness. Instead, he'd discovered that worth isn't something other people give you. It's something you earn through the choices you make when everything is on the line. Outside the hotel window, Willow Creek settled into evening quiet, but Marcus knew the peace was temporary. Word of their discoveries would spread quickly, and the remaining members of Jeremiah's network would soon realize their operation was under attack. The next phase of their fight would be even more dangerous than what they'd already survived. But as he looked around at the 4 women who'd refused to stay victims, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: confidence in the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family forged in fire and tempered by shared struggle. The church bells had stopped ringing, but their echo seemed to linger in the air like a promise that justice, though delayed, would not be denied forever. Thunder crashed overhead like the sound of God rearranging the furniture in heaven as Marshall Brennan burst through the hotel's front door. His face grim and his clothes soaked from the sudden storm that had rolled across the prairie with frightening speed. Water dripped from his hat brim as he scanned the lobby, his eyes finding Marcus immediately with the intensity of a man bringing urgent news. "We've got problems," Brennan announced without preamble. "Big problems. Samuel Garrett's been spotted 3 towns over, and he's not running away. He's recruiting an army." Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. Instead of disappearing after Jeremiah's capture, the network's main recruiter was doubling down on his criminal activities. What kind of army? Desperate men mostly. Unemployed drifters, failed prospectors, anyone willing to use violence for money. Brennan's voice carried the weight of experience with such situations. Local sheriff in Copper Falls says Garrett's been spreading word that a group of troublemakers stole a fortune in legitimate business assets, and he's offering substantial rewards for their return. Catherine descended the stairs at that moment, having heard the marshal's voice from her room above. The other women followed close behind, with Anna carrying baby Hope wrapped in blankets to protect her from the storm's chill. How substantial? Catherine asked, proving once again that her teacher's mind could cut straight to the heart of any problem. $500 per woman, plus whatever money you're carrying. Brennan pulled off his wet hat and shook it grimly. That's more than most working men see in 2 years. We're talking about serious motivation for serious violence. Ruth laughed, but the sound held no humor. So we've gone from being victims to being bounties. At least now we know what we're worth in the criminal marketplace. The storm outside intensified, rattling the hotel windows and sending sheets of rain against the glass like handfuls of thrown pebbles. Lightning illuminated the street in stark white flashes that made the familiar buildings of Willow Creek look foreign and threatening. It seemed fitting that nature itself was reflecting the darkness of their situation. There's more, Brennan continued, his expression growing even more serious. We intercepted communications suggesting the network has supporters in territorial government beyond just Wilson. People with the authority to issue warrants, transfer prisoners, and make evidence disappear. Mary sank into one of the lobby's worn chairs, the weight of continuous danger finally showing on her young face. So even if we survive Garrett's bounty hunters, we might not survive the legal system? That's why we're not waiting around to find out, Marcus said, his mind already working through possibilities. If they want to make this a fight, we'll give them one, but on our terms, not theirs. Anna shifted baby Hope to her other arm, the infant sleeping peacefully despite the storm raging outside. What are you proposing? Marcus looked around at the faces of the women who'd become his family through shared struggle. We go after Garrett ourselves. Hit him before he can organize his army, gather evidence of the larger conspiracy, and force the honest authorities to act. That's suicide, Brennan protested. You're talking about 4 women, one with a newborn baby, going up against a professional criminal with military resources. We're talking about 4 women who've already faced the impossible and won, Catherine corrected firmly, plus 1 man who's finally figured out what he's fighting for. The marshal studied their faces, seeing determination that couldn't be argued with or reasoned away. If you're serious about this insane plan, you'll need more than courage. You'll need weapons, supplies, inside information, and luck beyond anything reasonable people should expect. Then it's a good thing we stopped being reasonable people months ago, Ruth said with a grin that would have made a wolf nervous. As they huddled around the lobby's fireplace, planning what could easily be their final mission, Marcus found himself thinking about Rebecca's letter once more. She'd reached out across impossible distance and circumstances to bring help to women she'd never meet, sacrificing her own safety for the chance that others might find freedom. Now they were preparing to do the same for victims they'd never seen, in places they'd never been. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, but inside the small circle of lamplight, 5 adults and 1 baby were transforming from survivors into hunters. The predators who'd destroyed so many lives were about to discover that their victims had developed teeth and claws of their own. Dr. Harrison arrived just after midnight, carrying a medical bag and wearing an expression of grim determination that suggested he'd made his own decision about which side of this fight he belonged on. I've been thinking about those adoption records, he said without preamble. About families who might not know their children were stolen, and children who might not know their real parents are still alive. He pulled a thick folder from his bag, spreading papers across the lobby table. I've been corresponding with doctors in surrounding territories, comparing birth records with adoption papers. The patterns are disturbing: too many healthy babies from mothers who supposedly died in childbirth, too many adoptions processed through the same legal channels. Anna leaned forward, studying the documents while keeping baby Hope secure in her arms. How many children are we talking about? At least 30 over the past 2 years, Harrison replied. Possibly twice that number if the network's been operating longer than we suspected. The magnitude of the crime was staggering. Dozens of families destroyed, children stolen from their real parents, adoptive families unknowingly participating in kidnapping. The web of pain and deception stretched far beyond anything they'd initially imagined. All the more reason to end this quickly, Marcus said, his voice carrying new resolve. Every day we wait, more families are destroyed. As dawn approached, their plans began to take concrete shape. They would travel to Copper Falls under the pretense of fleeing Garrett's bounty hunters, but actually planning to infiltrate his operation and gather evidence of the larger conspiracy. It was dangerous beyond description, but the alternative, allowing the network to continue destroying lives, was unacceptable. Catherine packed the most damaging evidence in a secure pouch that would stay with her at all times. Ruth and Mary selected weapons from Marshal Brennan's confiscated arsenal, choosing firearms they could handle effectively. Anna prepared supplies for traveling with an infant, while Marcus studied maps and planned routes that would give them advantages in case of pursuit. The storm finally began to weaken as the first light of dawn painted the eastern horizon in shades of pink and gold. Standing at the hotel window, watching the new day struggle to break through the retreating clouds, Marcus realized they were embarking on a journey that would either establish justice or destroy them completely. But as he looked around at his companions, these remarkable women who'd refused to be broken by circumstances that would have crushed lesser souls, he felt something approaching confidence. They'd already survived the worst that evil men could devise, and they'd emerged stronger rather than weaker. Whatever Samuel Garrett and his army had planned for them, they were about to discover that their intended victims had become something far more dangerous than anything they'd faced before. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the reckoning was long overdue. The new day was breaking over Wyoming territory, and with it came the promise of either justice or destruction for all involved. The explosion that rocked the Copper Falls saloon at precisely noon sent splinters of wood and shards of glass flying across Main Street like deadly confetti, while black smoke poured from the building's shattered windows and men stumbled out coughing and cursing in languages that would make a preacher faint. Marcus crouched behind an overturned wagon with Catherine, watching their carefully laid plan unfold with the precision of a Swiss pocket watch, except this timepiece was designed to destroy rather than tell time. "Phase 1 complete," Catherine whispered, checking the small explosive device Ruth had fashioned from mining supplies they'd borrowed from an abandoned claim outside town. "Garrett's men are scattered, confused, and looking for external threats instead of internal ones." Through the smoke and chaos, Marcus could see Samuel Garrett himself emerging from the saloon's back door, his previously immaculate appearance now disheveled and his kind minister's face twisted with rage that revealed his true nature. The man who'd spent months recruiting innocent women with promises of marriage and happiness now looked like what he really was: a predator whose hunting ground had just been set on fire. "Where are they?" Garrett shouted at his scattered followers, many of whom were still picking themselves up from the street. "Find those women. I want them alive, but I don't care what condition they're in when you bring them to me." What Garrett didn't know was that Ruth and Mary were already inside the building next to the saloon, having entered through a cellar tunnel that connected the structures. While everyone's attention focused on the explosion, the two women were methodically searching Garrett's temporary headquarters for evidence of the larger conspiracy. Anna and baby Hope were safely hidden in the church at the far end of town, under the protection of a genuine minister who'd been horrified to learn about the network's activities. The Reverend, a man named Father Mackenzie with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering, had volunteered to guard them with his own life if necessary. 30 seconds until Phase 2, Marcus murmured, watching the chaos with the cool detachment of someone who'd learned to function under extreme pressure. They'd spent 3 days planning this operation, studying Garrett's routines and identifying weaknesses in his security arrangements. The second explosion came from the opposite end of town, near the telegraph office, sending Garrett's men running in that direction while cursing their inability to be in two places at once. But this blast was just another distraction. The real objective was the strongbox hidden in Garrett's private room above the saloon, containing correspondence with network leaders across multiple territories. Through the smoke, Marcus saw Ruth's red hair flash in a second-story window as she signaled success. She and Mary had found what they were looking for, and now came the dangerous part: getting out alive with evidence that could topple the entire criminal organization. But Garrett was smarter than they'd anticipated. Instead of chasing the diversions like his followers, he'd positioned himself where he could watch the saloon's upper floors. As Ruth appeared at the window, preparing to climb down the outside wall, Garrett raised a rifle with deadly precision. "There's one of them," he shouted, drawing a bead on Ruth's exposed position. $500 to whoever brings me her head." Marcus didn't hesitate. Breaking cover, he sprinted across the street through the swirling smoke, drawing his pistol as he ran. The distance was too great for accurate shooting, but he could create enough noise and confusion to spoil Garrett's aim. The rifle cracked like a whip, but the bullet went wide as Marcus's own shots forced Garrett to duck behind a water trough. Ruth seized the opportunity to drop from the window onto a pile of hay bales that Mary had positioned as a landing cushion. Then both women disappeared into the maze of back alleys that crisscrossed Copper Falls like a spider's web. "They're getting away!" one of Garrett's men yelled, pointing toward the alley where the women had vanished. But Garrett's cold intelligence was already working through the situation, analyzing what had happened and drawing uncomfortable conclusions. "This wasn't random," he said slowly, his minister's voice now carrying the chill of winter wind. "This was coordinated, professional. They knew exactly where to hit us and when." Marcus realized their advantage was evaporating faster than water in desert heat. Garrett had figured out that this wasn't a desperate escape attempt but a calculated assault on his operation. The man's survival instincts, honed by years of criminal activity, were kicking in with dangerous clarity. "Spread out in pairs," Garrett commanded his remaining followers. "They can't have gone far and they've got to regroup somewhere. Check every building, every hiding place, every cellar and attic in this town. I want them found within the hour." From his position behind the overturned wagon, Marcus watched Garrett's men organize themselves with military efficiency that suggested many of them had actual combat experience. These weren't just desperate drifters anymore. They were professional killers who'd found employment with a man smart enough to use their skills effectively. Catherine touched his arm, drawing his attention to a new problem developing at the far end of the street. "Look," she whispered, pointing toward the church where Anna and baby Hope were supposed to be safe. 3 of Garrett's men were approaching the church with weapons drawn, obviously intending to search it thoroughly. If they found Anna and the baby, their entire plan would collapse into a rescue mission with odds that favored nobody except the Undertaker. "We need a bigger distraction," Marcus realized, his mind racing through increasingly desperate options. "Something that will pull all of them away from the church long enough for Anna to escape." Catherine's eyes gleamed with the same dangerous intelligence that had helped them survive Jeremiah's mountain prison. "What if we give them exactly what they want?" "What do you mean?" "What if we let them catch us?" Marcus stared at her, wondering if the stress had finally affected her reasoning. "Catherine, that's not a plan. That's suicide." "No, it's strategy," she insisted. "Think about it, if Garrett captures us, he'll want to interrogate us personally, find out who else is involved, what evidence we've gathered, where the money is hidden. That gives Ruth and Mary time to get Anna and the baby out of town, and it gives us a chance to get close enough to Garrett to finish this permanently." The logic was sound, but the risks were enormous. If their gamble failed, they'd all be dead before sunset, and the network would continue destroying lives across the territory. But if they succeeded, they could end Garrett's operation and gather enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy. Marcus looked toward the church, where Anna's life and her baby's future hung in the balance, then back at Catherine's determined face. Sometimes the difference between heroism and foolishness was measured in minutes rather than years. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this my way with safeguards and backup plans." "Agreed," Catherine replied, "though I reserve the right to improvise if your safeguards don't work." As they prepared to walk into what could easily be their final confrontation, Marcus found himself thinking about the letter that had started this entire journey. Rebecca's desperate plea for help had brought him hundreds of miles to save women he'd never met, and now those same women were risking everything to save others they'd never meet. The smoke from the explosions was beginning to clear, revealing a town divided between those who supported justice and those who served corruption. In a few minutes, the balance would tip one way or the other, and the outcome would determine whether evil or good claimed victory in this remote corner of Wyoming territory. The rope around Marcus's wrists felt like fire against his skin as Garrett's men dragged him and Catherine through the streets of Copper Falls toward the makeshift courthouse that had become the criminal leader's temporary headquarters, while townspeople watched from behind curtains and doorways with expressions that revealed their true loyalties more clearly than any spoken words ever could. "Bring them inside," Garrett commanded from the courthouse steps, his minister's robes replaced by practical clothing that better suited his role as judge, jury, and potential executioner. I want to have a private conversation with our troublemakers before we decide their final fate. The courthouse interior had been transformed into something that looked more like a military command center than a hall of justice, with maps covering the walls, correspondence scattered across tables, and weapons stacked in corners like deadly furniture. Marcus counted at least 8 armed men inside the building, all watching their prisoners with the casual interest of predators deciding when to begin feeding. "Sit them down," Garrett ordered, indicating 2 chairs positioned in the center of the room where they'd be visible to everyone present. "And make sure those ropes are tight. I've heard these particular prisoners have a talent for escaping from secure locations." As they were forced into the chairs, Marcus caught Catherine's eye and saw the same calm determination that had sustained her through months of captivity and weeks of planning. Whatever happened next, she was ready for it, and her confidence helped steady his own nerves for the confrontation ahead. Garrett pulled up a 3rd chair and sat facing them, close enough that Marcus could see the intelligence burning behind his deceptively kind eyes. This wasn't a man who'd stumbled into criminal activity through desperation or circumstance. He was someone who'd chosen evil because it offered better profits than good. "I have to admit, you've impressed me," Garrett began, his voice carrying the same warm tones he'd probably used to convince dozens of women to trust him with their lives. "Jeremiah's operation was supposed to be foolproof, but you managed to destroy it completely. Deputy Marshal Wilson was a valuable asset, but you eliminated him too. Quite remarkable for a group of supposedly helpless victims." Catherine lifted her chin with the defiance that had carried her through every challenge they'd faced. "We stopped being victims the moment we decided to fight back. Now we're something you've never dealt with before." "And what's that?" "People who have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." Garrett's smile faltered slightly, as if he'd glimpsed something in Catherine's eyes that reminded him of his own mortality. "Perhaps. But you're forgetting that I have something you care about very much." He gestured toward one of his men, who disappeared through a side door and returned moments later escorting Father Mackenzie at gunpoint. The elderly minister's face was bruised and his clothes torn, but his eyes burned with righteous anger that seemed to fill the room with heat. "Your friends thought they were being clever, hiding the woman and baby in my church," Mackenzie said, his voice steady despite obvious pain. "But they underestimated my congregation's dedication to protecting innocent life." Marcus felt his heart sink like a stone dropped in deep water. If Garrett had captured the minister, then Anna and baby Hope were either dead or in the hands of men who viewed them as nothing more than valuable merchandise. "Where are they?" Catherine demanded, her calm facade cracking for the first time since their capture. "Safe," Garrett replied, enjoying the power that knowledge gave him over his prisoners. "For now. Their continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation with my requirements." "What requirements?" Garrett stood and walked to one of the wall maps, pointing at locations marked with red pins that seemed to stretch across half the Western territories. "You've cost me a significant investment in time, money, and resources. I'm a reasonable businessman, so I'm prepared to accept compensation rather than revenge." He turned back to face them, his expression shifting from fake kindness to genuine menace. "You're going to help me rebuild my network, starting with a complete list of everyone who assisted your escape, every piece of evidence you gathered, and every penny of Jeremiah's money you stole." Marcus almost laughed at the audacity of the proposal. "You want us to help you kidnap and murder more women? I want you to help me restore order to a business that was operating smoothly until your interference disrupted it." Garrett's voice carried the tone of someone explaining simple arithmetic to slow children. "The demand for adoption services continues to grow, and there are many women who would benefit from the opportunities my network provides." "Opportunities?" Catherine's voice rose with incredulous rage. "You call imprisonment, rape, and murder opportunities? I call them practical solutions to complex social problems," Garrett replied calmly. "Unwed mothers need support, childless couples need families, and men like me need profit. Everyone benefits from the arrangement." Father Mackenzie spoke from his position near the door, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades ministering to human suffering. There's a special place in hell reserved for people who profit from the pain of innocence. And I suspect you'll be finding out about it sooner than you think. Garrett's mask of civility finally slipped completely away, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath the surface. Old man, you're about to join your god a lot sooner than you planned if you don't learn to keep your mouth shut. But even as the words left Garrett's mouth, new sounds began filtering through the courthouse windows: shouts, running footsteps, and the unmistakable crack of gunfire from somewhere outside. The criminal leader's face went pale as he realized his supposedly secure headquarters was under attack. "What's happening out there?" he barked at one of his men, who rushed to the window and peered through the curtains. "It's the territorial marshal," the lookout reported, his voice tight with panic. "He's got at least 20 men with him, and they're surrounding the building." Marcus felt a surge of hope so powerful it almost lifted him from his chair. Somehow, Marshal Brennan had tracked them to Copper Falls and arrived with enough force to challenge Garrett's army. But hope quickly turned to concern as he realized Anna and baby Hope were still somewhere in the building, potentially caught in the crossfire of a siege. Garrett's survival instincts kicked in with the speed of a striking snake. "Bring the woman and baby here," he ordered. "If the marshal wants to play siege games, we'll see how committed he is to protecting innocent life when those innocents are standing between him and his targets." As his men rushed to comply, Garrett turned back to Marcus and Catherine with an expression that promised suffering beyond imagination. "This changes nothing about our arrangement. In fact, it makes your cooperation even more valuable. You're going to help me negotiate our way out of this situation, or everyone you care about dies slowly while you watch." The courthouse had become a powder keg with lit fuses running in all directions, and Marcus could see no way to save everyone he cared about without sacrificing someone. Outside, Marshal Brennan's voice echoed across the street, demanding surrender and promising justice. Inside, Garrett prepared to use innocent lives as shields for his escape. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether good or evil claimed victory in this remote corner of the Wyoming territory. Everything they'd fought for, everyone they tried to save, and all the hopes they'd built for the future hung in the balance of the next few minutes. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Anna and baby Hope, and Marcus knew their time for planning was over. Whatever happened next would require courage beyond anything they'd shown before, and luck beyond anything reasonable people should expect. But as Father Mackenzie began quietly reciting a prayer for divine intervention, Marcus realized they'd already proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept defeat. The question now was whether they had one more miracle left in them when they needed it most.